Hello, welcome. I'm Chris Field, Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Very pleased that you can join us for today's discussion of the State of Climate Reflections from COP30 from Stanford's delegation. Today's conversation is hosted by the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Annual conferences of the parties of or COPs are the vehicles for ongoing negotiations on UN treaties, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This year's COP was in November in Belém, Brazil. It was the 30th of these COPs for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It comes 10 years after the Paris Agreement of 2015. This was an important COP. It was the first COP without an official US delegation. It comes in a critical time when the international consensus on the need for action is strong, but progress is notably much too slow. We're fortunate that almost every year Stanford sends a delegation of students, postdocs, and faculty as official COP observers and experts. We had a great group this year, and I'll have a chance to hear from three of them today. Overall, we have four panelists for today's conversation. Let me introduce them, and then we'll move to conversation. Two of our panelists are PhD students who were members of the Stanford delegation. June Choi is a PhD candidate in Earth System Science. Her research focuses on climate finance and quantifying climate change impacts to inform equitable adaptation and disaster risk management. June's other projects have addressed innovative mechanisms for financing mitigation projects and building resilience and community flood insurance. As a member of the Stanford COP delegation, June was remarkable for having the best ever overview of everything that was happening at the COP. Rebecca Grecken is a PhD candidate in energy science and engineering. She researches tools that use real-world data to quantify and mitigate CO2 emissions from food. Her study of the university's dining hall purchases built software to help trace the emissions impact of over 150,000 unique items for institutions serving 3.5 billion meals per year. One of two Brazilians on the Stanford COP delegation, Rebecca provided unique insight on how the COP leaders were thinking and strategizing. And Mengye Zhu is a new member of the Stanford community. She started last fall as a senior scientist at the Natural Capital Alliance. Her research is focused on climate and environmental policy and political economy, with an emphasis on methane mitigation. She's an experienced climate negotiator with years of background as a member of the Chinese COP delegations. As a member this year of the Stanford delegation, Mengye was a source of wisdom about goings-on behind the scenes. And to add some exceptional expertise to our panel today, I'm thrilled that we're being joined by Sue Biniaz. Sue is currently a lecturer and senior fellow at the Yale-Jackson School of Global Affairs. Previously, she was a legal advisor at the State Department and the lead climate lawyer and climate negotiator for the U.S. government. Famous for her role as a closer, Sue has a unique ability to transform a contentious and chaotic discussion into clear text that works for everyone. Sue deserves a lot of the credit for crafting the Paris Agreement, where I think of her role as that of a master sculptor, transforming rough marble into enduring art. The format for today's discussion is that we'll start with a few questions from me, and after about half an hour, we'll transition to input from members of the audience. And to get a question into the queue for audience participation, please enter your questions into the chat. I guess we don't have a Q&A box today, and we'll select from those. Let me start with an overview question for Sue. This was a very unusual COP coming at a chaotic time. How would you place it in the spectrum of what we've seen from COPs in the past in terms of whether or not it lived up to expectations and whether or not it indicates that we're on a new and especially challenging trajectory for work on climate?
Well, thanks, Chris, for having me, and thanks for the question. And hello, everybody. I think somebody put it best who was down in Belém when they said that the test for this COP was that it didn't have to be a big win, but it also couldn't be a failure. And I think it was neither of the above, I guess. That's what I would say. I think on the positive ledger, I think it was important that the parties were able to agree on something by consensus, right? Because it would have been very disappointing and sort of disconcerting if the countries in the world had not been able to do that. Some processes were agreed to. Now, often that's considered maybe a low art form because if you can't agree to substance, you agree to a process. But two of the paragraphs in that sort of overarching decision do open the door to agreeing to more on mitigation, and so I think that was somewhat positive. Brazil introduced some innovations into this COP, which are also kind of noteworthy. They had pieces of the COP held the week before in different cities. They tried to align what we think of as the outside action agenda with the inside in a way that was maybe more coherent than COPs have done in the past. And they also, they and others launched various actions and initiatives. In the case of Brazil, they launched the Tropical Forest Forever facility. Others did all kinds of things on side stages that are noteworthy. I think on the less bright side, quickly, there was a weaker response to the gap in NDCs, nationally determined contributions, than I would have liked to see. Right before the COP, there was a report, the sort of synthesis report that is done after countries hand in their emissions targets under the Paris Agreement. It was pretty clear that we're not on track to meet certainly not 1.5, and probably not even well below 2 degrees as our global temperature goal. And one would have thought this being the NDCs being kind of the backbone of the Paris Agreement, and this being the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, that the parties would have been able to say more, do more, come up with some kind of plan to address the gap. I mean, you basically need an electron microscope to find any reference to the NDC shortfall in that major decision. And there was also very little pressure, if any, placed on China, even though they put in a very disappointing NDC a couple months before the COP. So I would say it was a kind of a mixed blessing, better than it could have been, in the sense that the parties did agree to something and there were some positive outcomes. But on what I had thought was maybe a litmus test for this COP, which was the ability to respond to the gap in terms of the temperature goal. Probably if you were at Stanford, you might not have gotten a passing grade on that one.
Well, I appreciate the characterization to a barely passing grade. And I wonder if you want to comment briefly on the consequences of not having a U.S. delegation at this COP.
Well, I think, I was there and talked to a lot of countries. I think given the positions of this administration, I think countries were actually pretty relieved not to have a U.S. team there. They might not have even been able to agree to anything by consensus, because I don't think the U.S., as currently constituted, would have agreed with a lot of the things that were in that major decision, even though most people would have considered it, pretty weak tea. Um, but it not having the U.S. there as a force for good, I think, was pretty palpable from what I heard from other delegations. First of all, one of the U.S. kind of tribal roles, if you will, was always to kind of push back on China, Saudi Arabia, and everything. I mean, always had a very friendly relationship off stage, I would say. But one of the sort of dynamics in the negotiation was always, one side would say X, and our side counted on us to say not X or Y or whatever, and that was, I think, weaker at COP30 without a U.S. team. And the other thing that the U.S. always did when it was a sort of climate friendly team was work out either behind the scenes or overtly, that kind of bilaterally worked out compromises or deals, whatever, with countries, big developing countries. And I don't think that was really done. I think in a way, the countries that we were most kind of aligned with in our various groups, the umbrella group and the EU, they're not used to playing the role that we used to play. And so it's going to take a bit of time. Hopefully they will take on those roles. But, for example, the things that were not agreed in this major decision, maybe they could have been agreed if we'd been able to do the kinds of things we used to do, let's say with China or Saudi Arabia. But, nobody was really playing those roles.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll come back to some of these themes. I want to turn now to Rebecca, who was one of our Brazilians on the delegation and also a first-time COP attendee. And I wonder if you want to start with just a couple of quick impressions about what it was like to have this meeting occur in Brazil and what you heard from Brazilians about the way it amplified things that they're trying to accomplish with their climate goals.
Yeah. So I really appreciate Sue's comment that Brazil sort of was able to effectively introduce some new innovations into sort of the COP tradition. And I was really happy to see a lot of different, very Brazilian aspects of culture really well represented within COP. I haven't been to other COPs, so I don't know how common it is for countries to sort of do that integration with the local culture to sort of share that and influence and inspire what's happening within COP. But so I think one of the big things was I heard it a lot at least. I hope you guys did too. Mutirão was sort of one of the theme words of COP, and that word in Portuguese means sort of coming together as a collective to work towards something that is beneficial for the community. Um, and that's very common in Brazil. A lot of times, you know your neighbors. My grandmother has lived in her house in Sorocaba city in the state of São Paulo, her basically more than my mom's entire life. So it's really a community and people come together and sort of are able to help in need. And so there was Mutirão sort of applied to a bunch of, it was the Mutirão for climate finance, the Mutirão for cities, the Mutirão for everything. And so it was nice to see sort of that aspect of it. The other thing I really enjoyed was the mascot for COP this year was Curupira, which is a sort of character from Brazilian folklore, whose entire purpose is to protect the forest. And so what he does is, there's sort of these stories of people going in and maybe hunting animals that they shouldn't be hunting or tearing down the forest, and he sort of comes and takes revenge on behalf of the forest. For those actions that are not beneficial to the forest. And so I thought that was also kind of very inspiring as we often don't really think necessarily of the consequences in terms of thinking that the forest is going to come back and sort of take action against us. But sort of that reminder and the image I thought was very, very interesting. And sort of made me happy to see something that is sort of folklore that's been around in Brazil for forever. In terms of sort of what I've heard from Brazilians, people were very excited that it was happening in Brazil. People were both a little hesitant and also very excited that it was happening in Belém. Belém obviously is a city that is in the Amazon rainforest. And the more traditional decision would have maybe have been for it to have been in São Paulo or Rio, where sort of there's a lot more infrastructure already in place. But I think it was really important, at least for me and for other Brazilians, to sort of both have the forest be so close. And also part of the reason, at least from what I heard about the decision to have it in Belém, was actually also because if it were in São Paulo or Rio, the indigenous people would have had a much harder time showing up in the way that they did. Um, I haven't been to other COPs again, but I don't think I've heard or seen that sort of showing up of indigenous peoples at COPs before in the same way. And so I think that that was also a really important decision that was made that I think helped sort of really place the COP in Brazil in the way that sort of Brazilians would would um, would take it. And I'll stop there. But there
I,
was.
I want to do a quick follow-up on the cop mascot.
Sure.
And well, I have two questions. One is why in the folklore are his feet on backwards? And the second is that was he chosen, do you think, explicitly to imply that our failure to protect the natural world can come back and bite us if we're not paying attention?
I'd like to think yes. I obviously wasn't in the room when the decision was made to choose the Curupira, but I think that for Brazilians who know who Curupira is, was very clear. It was a if we don't do something fast, something's going to come to bite us. And in terms of his feet being backwards, I'm actually not entirely sure why his feet are backwards. Part of it, I think, is actually because then the idea is that if you're walking in the forest, and you see, backwards walking, footprints on the floor, you're supposed to be able to know that it's the Curupira. There's actually several different Brazilian folklore characters that have something weird going on with number of feet or position of feet and things like that. I'll have to do some homework on that one and get back to you on
Okay.
why they're backwards. But
Okay. Um, Mengye is as an experienced COP observer and somebody who's worked closely with the Chinese delegation over the years. I, I wonder if you can comment on the point that Sue raises about uh, what she characterizes disappointing level of ambition in the Chinese NDC. But I was also really interested in the amount of discussion we were seeing and hearing about the just pervasive role of Chinese technology in driving adoption of renewable energy and electric vehicles around the world, and how much that was really changing the landscape of what people were thinking of as possibilities.
Well, thank you, Chris, for the invitation. Also, thank you, Sue, for the comments. Yeah, I know a lot of discussions around China's new NDCs, and it's been controversial, and I think was a theme at COP this year. So I would like to share some of my reflections, not necessarily representing the Chinese delegation, as I'm not, technically speaking, not a member, but I, over the years, worked with members of the Chinese delegation and engaged in the U.S. and China climate cooperation for the past, the previous administration. So I would like to reflect on a few things, especially regarding what Chris you were describing about China's role in the clean technologies, and it can actually drive the forces to transformation. So one thing I would like to highlight is that we should really have confidence that the market forces are moving into one direction, and it is not reversible. Like like what we described, the transition is actually a secular trend, and actually John Kerry emphasized that in multiple times over the years, even before COP, that it is not about a single country, it's about economics. Because renewables and the adoption of clean technologies are actually making profit. So for example, in 2024, 90% of the new power capacity came from renewables, contributing nearly 70% of the new electricity generation globally. And specifically in the US in 2025, where we see all these backlash and rollbacks, renewables actually made up 88% of the new US power generation capacity by September last year. And what we can see, and also the US is the largest employer is actually Texas. And over the past decade, we see solar costs were dropped threefolds, and mostly by the contribution of China. And the EV went from 1% to 15% in global sales. So with all these dynamics, and China really played a role in terms of driving down the costs, where make sure clean technologies are actually accessible and also cost-effective, affordable for countries globally, and especially for developing countries, which is very important. So currently, the dynamics or the landscape of solar deployment, clean technology deployment, the challenge is, well, part of the challenge we see on the cost side, but mostly is on the more like political economy side, where many fossil fuel interest groups are against the trend. So we should have faith and confidence in the market forces, where as long as a certain technology or clean technology or transformation or making economic sense, it will happen regardless. So that's my response to that question. In addition to that, I would also like to highlight, a couple of things on China in terms of well, a lot of people, I would say, describing China's role as climate leader. I know many experts in China on the team sort of hesitate about talking about Chinese leadership. But I think in that sense, maybe leadership is not what describes, more like the contribution that China can make to global climate action. I think there are a couple of things that I observe actually. So first of all, well, China really emphasizes stability and predictability. And currently, stability and predictability, I think, are really valuable in this geopolitical environment. So for a very long time, I think the U.S. and China discussions around the ambition, and why China's been not pushing the highest kind of ambitious targets. But what it really is China's focus to make sure that there's a stable and coordinated process and transformation at both national and subnational levels to make sure that climate commitments can be achieved and ideally can be overachieved. I think part of it is because of China's planning tradition in the political economy and the policy context, but also has to do with the Chinese philosophy and psychology about commitments, where failing to deliver those commitments is truly a shame, culturally, while overachieving is immensely rewarding. So I think that's the reason why we see the Chinese NDC may not be seems to be high, but actually the efforts that have to make to achieve that targets are immense. So that's what I think about the NDC.
Yeah, this emphasis on under-promising and over-delivering, really, really important. I need to correct something I said earlier, that we didn't have a Q&A box. We do have a Q&A box, but Zoom was hiding it from you earlier. So if you have a question that you want to ask panelists later on, please enter it in the Q&A box and we'll go through those. And I apologize for being one step behind the curve on Zoom as usual. Let me pick up on the theme that Mingyi raised about the importance of economics and finance. In June, I know that's your main topic of research, and about unleashing a finance that's relevant for development, both in the adaptation and mitigation sides of the issue. And I wonder what you saw that you found encouraging and discouraging about discussions around finance in Belém.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And thank you again for Woods for bringing this delegation. It was my first time in Brazil, as well as the first time at a COP conference. So regarding the climate finance topics that I was mainly paying attention to, and is also the core subject of my research, I think the main thing I was looking for at this COP, being an implementation-focused COP, as Sue mentioned, I was interested in how countries were addressing the financing gap. So last year, there was a decision to mobilize climate finance to the tune of 300 billion a year, going from global north to global south countries. But that left a $1 trillion gap in estimated needs that the high-level expert group had put forward. And so on the climate finance side, there was a big effort to understand how can we implement changes to that goal to ensure that we can stop gap the shortfall. So with that respect, two things that happened at COP that was interesting. Chris and I think Rebecca mentioned the Tropical Forest Forever facility. And so that is a global scale blended finance fund, which aims to bring in capital from public sector sources to scale up private investment and to conserve forests. And it's based on revenue streams that would be delivered to the tune of around 2.5% of returns generated by that fund is going to be dedicated to conserving forests, which would be monitored by satellites to ensure that the conservation is taking place. And so this kind of blended finance fund that tries to bring in public sources of capital to scale up private capital mobilization towards conservation of nature at this global scale. Brazil really led the effort on that. So that was really exciting to see the launch of that. I think by the end of this year, Brazil is targeting around $10 billion in intended contributions that have been announced for that goal. On the other side of the finance debate, I was really interested in the loss and damage financing. So what that meant was personally, I was spending a lot of time in the island country pavilions trying to understand what were country strategies for approaching negotiations, what resilience finance actually looks like in these countries, and how they were trying to mobilize an alliance across small island states to highlight this the need for financing, especially for resilience in these countries. A couple of things that really stood out. The first day, official day on week one, there was a big launch for funding proposals for the financing resilience and loss and damage. And so countries can now submit proposals for how they expect to spend funds received through this loss and damage funding. There's around 250 million dollars that are allocated and that countries can apply for. And one of the things I heard from island delegations was that it still is not managing expectations on the emergency and recovery funding side, because this is very much an ex ante, please let us know what kind of funding you want to receive from this fund, rather than a promise that we'll deliver finance and liquidity in the aftermath of disasters. And that's really the key funding mechanism that I think these countries were looking for. But I think on the operational side, the board of the Loss and Damage Fund still prefers the prearranged finance mechanism for this. So it was really interesting to hear the perspectives of what people thought were missing from this. And maybe I'll weave some more insights from that in the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, June. And Sue, we've heard from everybody about how this was supposed to be an implementation COP, and I've heard some people say that, well, it wasn't really about advancing the negotiations. It was really about kind of enabling state and non-state actors to come forward with implementation ideas that allow them to deliver on things that have been negotiated previously. Is that a fair characterization of where we are now? And what's your sense of whether or not state and non-state actors really were stepping up to meet the challenge of previously negotiated conclusions?
Yeah, a few comments. First, I think Brazil confused people throughout the year, with all due respect to the team, which I love. They kept changing the theme of the COP. And every few weeks, you would hear that it was had a different name attached to it. It started out as maybe like the Amazon COP, the Forest COP, as you say, the implementation COP. At a certain point, it was the COP of truth, and then it was the adaptation COP. And, every time you do that, you make it harder for people to know, first of all, to judge the COP, right? Did it succeed or not? You don't know what the metric for success is if you don't know what the host country is trying to do or deliver with the COP. And I also think it just, it confused participants as to what to focus on. So yes, there was talk about implementation throughout the year, but because so many other themes were thrown out there, I think, it wasn't super clear that that was the theme of this COP. So that was maybe point one. Point two, yes, there was a lot done on the side, through various side events, announcements, et cetera, to promote, quote unquote, implementation of things that had been agreed to before. Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And I would just, footnote in that regard is that, the US had a big showing at this COP, which I think we should also be aware of. Even though there was no official delegation, states, cities, mayors, governors, et cetera, the US Climate Alliance, the America's All In Coalition, everybody was there in full force, not only the week before in Rio at the local leaders forum, but at the COP itself. And I think that sent a good signal, not only in terms of like the merits of what those various groups or entities are doing, but just to show the world kind of diplomatically that the US is not monolithic and hasn't just fallen off the face of the earth as an entire country. So I would note that. But my third point would be, I don't think the fact that we are in implementation mode removes the need for certain things to be agreed by consensus. So it's not an either or. It's not, because there is this kind of argument out there. Why do we even need the Paris Agreement anymore? Why do we need the COPs? We're all about implementation now and action. But I don't think action and implementation keep going, without the kind of core of these COPs with pressure for countries to agree on things, send signals and kind of coalesce around certain commitments, themes, et cetera. So I think, you need both.
And could you just say a couple more words about this idea of sort of what COPs are good for in terms of setting ambition and nudging the process in constructive ways? Because a lot of times we hear, oh, the UN never accomplishes anything. It's all just about talk. But you've really found a way to make the COP deliver progress, or at least make the formal agreements continue to advance.
Yeah, I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that these COPs are either easy or have completely delivered. But, take the Paris Agreement. We're in a better shape now, as you know, as a scientist. We're in better shape from a point of view of global temperature rise, also in terms of adaptation action, finance. There are all kinds of things that would not be where they are if not for this agreement. Are we on track at the moment to meet these ambitious goals that we set for ourselves? No, not at our current sort of speed and scope. But I think the COP, there are actually two COPs. I always call one of them the Greater Metropolitan COP. The non-negotiated outcomes have taken on a greater role over the years as the things to be negotiated kind of get done, and therefore, there are fewer of them at each COP, and almost together they form like this. But the proportion of inner to outer probably changes from COP to COP and over time. But the COP has become the sort of biggest event of the year. It's an action-forcing event, even apart from the things that are negotiated among parties. I mean, most entities, actors, countries you talk to throughout the year, they're preparing things for the COP. Other organizations, fora, whatever, are also preparing for the COP. I mean, maybe it's because it's at the end of the year, but whether because it's the biggest thing going or because it's, generally November, December, it has taken on that a kind of a role of not just the place where things get negotiated, but the place where things, or get delivered, get announced, get discussed, and everybody goes. So there's so much interaction between different types of people and actors. It's a bit of a one-stop shopping opportunity. If you're an NGO, if you're a country, if you're a private sector, it's a place you can go and meet with, governments, your peers, all kinds of other people. If you look at people's calendars every day, it's like a, speed dating, right? Most people have like 14 things each day. And, that has to be good, even if nothing were to get negotiated. But, personally, maybe I'm overly invested in the negotiations, having done so many of them. But, I'm hoping in terms of going forward that the COP30 outcome was not the new normal in terms of like, that's all we're now going to get from now on, particularly without the US as a player. I hope that reverses itself. I hope it was kind of a one-off. It was an unusual year. Brazil didn't put too much pressure on its BRICS friends. There were a lot of things you could point to for why we had somewhat of a disappointing negotiated outcome, but I think that, there's the possibility to reverse that, at least to a certain extent.
And a lot of value in keeping the conversations going, even in challenging times. Let me riff on the 14 things on your calendar every day. And Rebecca, let me ask you about a point you raised earlier about the importance of having the COP in the Amazon forest. And did you feel like you saw nature and the protection of nature highlighted, or what would you have liked to have seen in terms of recognition of the importance of being in the Amazon?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Obviously, it can't be in the middle of the forest because you need all this sort of infrastructure. And I was in a slightly different, I think, context than most people who attended COP. I was lucky or unlucky, depending on how you want to look at it. But in terms of housing, my housing was a boat on the Amazon River. And so I woke up every day and I looked out the window and I was on the Amazon and I could see sort of the islands that are close to Belém, sort of on the river, just as soon as I opened my eyes. And so that was a really sort of grounding for me like that was the first thing I saw was the Amazon, the forest, the trees, the islands, what we're trying to protect. I don't think most people got that privilege. And there were certain events that were held in various parts of the city, which I also thought was very interesting. Um, there were there was one sort of museum that was entirely revamped called the Emilio Gauди for COP, and I think that was also sort of a really nice way to tie in sort of nature into the COP events. There were lots of different events that were happening within the museum over the course of the 2 weeks. Um, I don't think it was enough. It was sort of something that you had to go out and seek. It wasn't something that was like directly integrated into everything that was happening. Sort of before showing up in Belém, I was sort of imagining something where you would look out the windows and see trees and forest and that sort of thing. And I actually ended up in a lot of rooms with no windows. Um, so I think in terms of that aspect of sort of maybe integrating nature and the real impact of all these things that are getting negotiated, where people are deciding if it's going to be a square or a regular a square bracket or a parentheses. Sort of it's very easy to forget the real impact of what is being negotiated and how that's going to affect sort of what's around. I did appreciate the fact, like I said, there were lots of indigenous communities and tribes and people who did show up. And so I know, for example, June, you got a chance to buy a beautiful necklace from one of the indigenous people who, sort of set up shop right outside the entrance to COP. So there were sort of these like small intrusions that you were able to interact with and engage with and sort of remember what the bigger point of all of this. But I think it could have been done better. There was um, one place in the food court that did really traditional acai, but it was sort of really actually far and you had to go looking for it. It wasn't, again, sort of that you could find it if you were looking for it, but it wasn't sort of as in your face as I wish it had been. Um, so I think that's my response on that. I did remember why Kurupita's feet are backwards. And that's because it's to trick people who are trying to chase him or to catch him. And so if his feet are backwards, you're going to go the wrong way when you're trying to catch him. So that's
Okay,
why.
well, that's a good narrative for where we are with climate, that we need a way to escape to higher progress. I want to turn to questions from the audience in just a couple of minutes, and so please enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Megan, let me ask one more question of you, but before we do that, and I wonder if you can speak to the issue of how the absence of the U.S. was perceived. I was really grateful that you arranged a visit with the Stanford delegation and the Chinese climate envoy, who really emphasized the point that the U.S. role is critical, and that even in the absence of a federally organized delegation, the U.S. community, states, cities, universities still have a lot to do. And how do you see that playing out on the international landscape?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for the question. I think also Sue knows this know even better than I do from the US perspective. So I think the US and China Climate Cooperation is having a really long history, and went through. This was not the first time the US is absent from the global climate discourse in the federal government. So like 10 years ago in 2016, that was my first COP in Marrakesh. I had a full experience when the administration changed during that period of time. And on the US and China, I think China and the officials and also the experts leading experts in the field all feel like the necessary to continue conversations with the US, regardless of the federal's presence. I think that's kind of the overall kind of the idea of continuing the collaboration regardless of the form. So I think this is very important. Even for during the Trump's first administration, China and the US and China experienced that period where, for example, California really stood up and played a role in terms of having the continued engagement. So that was really critical. And on the research side, in US and China, on collaborations on environment and climate studies never stopped. And there was always engagement between the research communities. And so I think on that, even with NatCap, so NatCap has established collaboration with our Chinese partners and namely Chinese Academy of Sciences for over almost more than a decade. So the continued kind of research collaboration actually helped not only for climate, but also for other environmental issues like nature, for example. So there's a concept NatCaps developed and an indicator NatCaps developed. It's called GEP. It's called Gross Ecosystem Product, which I really think if we have more time, we can more about it, actually can contribute to climate adaptation and resilience. And so that has been adopted officially by the Chinese government as the first country to adopt that, and many other countries followed. So I think with that kind of collaboration, we can really see maintain the momentum and the spirit. Even though US and China have a lot of disagreements around things, but as long as we are on the table together, there's an opportunity to move the needle forward. And the US and China collaboration is really critical to global climate action. And having this ratchet effect where US push China and China push US, and will push the whole global agenda moving forward. I think that's the spirit, and I think most people from China, Chinese climate community would agree on that. So I really hope, as Special Envoy Liu highlighted, that China's been continue to do things until we welcome the US coming back in the future, so that we hold as a placeholder, we hold a place for US and China engagement in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think the critical role of the U.S. as a important actor, a positive actor in climate is absolutely essential, as both Sue and you have clearly stated. And there's a lot that can be done through the We Are Still In and California's engagement in other states, but there's a critical role for the federal government as well. Let me start turning to the questions online, and I want to start with one that's explicitly for June. This one's from Rega Sota, and you guys can see it. It says, June, thank you for your comments. You mentioned having observed the loss and damage discussions among the small island states. Could you comment on the discussions of including environmental services in national accounts? And was that part of the discussion? Are there disagreements among states in how to approach environmental valuation? You may want to comment on this as well.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think at a high level, I didn't pick up on many disagreements within the countries about topics around climate finance. What I sensed was there was much more discussion around how to build alliances in order to make their demands more heard or have a stronger presence during the negotiations. Regarding the ecosystem evaluation specific aspect, I think the indebtedness of these countries and how that prevents these countries from investing in nature and resilience was the lens through which I had these discussions. So for instance, the climate ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda was talking about how the debt for climate nature swaps kind of deals that Belize has done to protect the oceans, that kind of deal doesn't seem possible for Antigua and Barbuda in a world where their debt is seen as highly unsustainable or unwanted by the investment community. And deals like that to swap debt for conservation in ecosystems, of course, depends also on being able to value that ecosystem and those services. I think Mengye will have a lot to talk about how we're advancing research on that front. But what I heard from the delegations was very much that in a world where investing in these countries or the debt held by these countries are perceived as highly risky, how do you ensure that the capital can still flow to these countries to invest in nature and resilience? I think that was a key concern. I didn't notice many disagreements, but there might be things I'm missing on action towards including that kind of environmental accounting into national accounts. What I sensed mainly was that there was a lack of understanding of how they would finance these things, even if the valuation was clear.
Yeah, and also appreciating that debt is so much more expensive for poor countries that need it the most. And if there are ways you can use the natural assets accounting to knock a little bit off of that interest rate difference between rich and poor world, that can make a huge difference. I mean, did you want to comment on this especially from your Natural Capital Alliance hat?
Yes, thank you, Chris. And also, I would like to echo June's point. We see some difficulties for sure, and definitely, like the Brazilian presidency pushed forward the TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever facility, and even though the initial financing was not ideal, it still set us kind of the first step of valuing nature. I think this is flags the importance of integrating the nature into the climate discourse, which I think what the Brazilian presidency has done the best for this COP is to incorporating nature into the conventional climate discourse. Normally, climate more like a climate mitigation driven. So on that, I would like to say. This is valuing nature and integrating nature's value into decision making is really important. because we can, even I'm from the climate mitigation perspective, I increasingly see the need of integrating nature into decision making in terms of climate mitigation strategies. For example, energy transition, and because energy transition has a huge impact and implications for nature, and also nature similarly has an implication for energy transition, and those two cannot go silos. And nature, I think oftentimes are really underestimated in the climate mitigation community in terms of their contribution. But it's not just about carbon storage or sequestration. It's the world's most important infrastructure that protect us from disasters. So I think the point is, instead of seeing nature as something nice to have, it is actually a national security issue where nature protects us from the threat of climate change. So I think on that, we really need, from that perspective, we really need to value nature, because that tells us what level of investment that the defense actually requires. So I think in that point, it's the developing natural capital accounting system is really important for countries in terms of climate adaptation and reinforcing climate resilience. So I talk about GEP, but we don't have enough time to explain more. It's a metric to capture the economic value of nature that has been adopted in China. And I think it could potentially serve a greater role in terms of China's new NDC commitment regarding building a climate adaptive society. I think there's something that a scientist and science research community and policy community, we can explore further.
Great. Let me stick with the theme of climate finance and this question from Mike McCracken, who's a leading climate scientist. It's great to have you with us today, Mike. And I'll ask this one to Sue. The question reads, with perhaps 1 billion people in the north and excluding China and India, 5 billion in the south, and there's talk of climate finance at the scale of $1 trillion a year or more, that works out to about $1,000 per person per year over some period of indefinite time. And is this really viable? And how should we think about economic development in the global south in the context of the components that are basically self-led versus those that depend on international transfers?
Well, thanks. I don't think I'm an expert in that area. I think, my expertise, if anything, was sort of negotiating the, financial aspects of the regime rather than, the real world and exactly how much is needed and where it's going to come from. I think one of the panelists talked earlier about the agreement 2 years ago did make that distinction between what's going to come from governments and not just the global north. We changed the paradigm 2 years ago to include contributions from all parties, at least those coming through the MDBs. That was super important to the United States, and we worked that out with China and others. But as you said, as one of you said, that's $300 billion by 2035. But the experts had said that the need by 2035 was going to be 1.3 trillion. So one of the kind of work streams over the next several years is to figure out how does the private sector deliver on the extra 1 trillion by 2035. There was a roadmap on that topic produced over the last year to be kind of examined at this past COP. I would say it, probably didn't get as much play as it should have. There was not that much discussion of those ideas and what should happen next. But that's so anyway, we've got sort of two things to work on under the Paris Agreement. One is the delivery of the 300. Which includes not only kind of bilateral assistance, but also multilateral MDBs, that kind of thing. And then the trillion that's going to somehow have to be pushed in a sense and also pulled because you need some kind of incentives in the recipient countries. And, one of the interesting work streams that Brazil put on the table during the G20 in 2024, which I participated in, is they sort of forced the climate people to get together with the finance people and combine those tracks. And one of the issues that was raised was interesting, which is how do you design an NDC, a nationally determined contribution, to attract foreign investment? And that had not really been given much kind of airtime before that. So, that's one thing that people will work on, but there are many other things if you're going to get to $1 trillion by 2035 in private sector finance.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think the really critical point you make there is that this has to be about investment where there's a realistic expectation of getting the money back and potentially even making a profit. And that if we need to drive some of it on direct foreign assistance, that it's only going to be a small fraction, and that we need to be able to frame the international flows as investment, as both Mengye and June have already described. We're down to just a couple minutes left. I wonder if each of you might want to make a very brief closing thought about what you took away from the COP. Rebecca, let's start with you.
Sure. So I guess I went to COP with my PhD sort of lens, which is actually in commercial building air conditioning and trying to reduce energy and the impacts sort of energy consumption of air conditioning, especially with climate change and increasing temperatures. And so my really big takeaway from all the sessions that I attended, I also got the wonderful opportunity to shadow one of the special envoys for urban solutions, was really that we need more of a formal mechanism to engage subnational leaders, and so governors and mayors, and also recognize the work that's being done there, in large part because we're headed towards 70% of the world's population living in cities. We're headed towards 80% of emissions coming from cities. And we've been talking a lot about financing. In terms of the financing, cities only get about 10% of the financing that is already available. Here we've been talking a lot about the financing that needs to be available and is planned to be available. And so my big takeaway was we've had a lot of progress. There still is plenty to be done. And I think one of the big sort of key pieces for unlocking sort of that potential to be able to implement all of these things that we have been talking and discussing and negotiating is really sort of engaging the cities and the states in a more formal way and integrating that into sort of the COP ecosystem, which up to this point has mostly been sort of at the national level. And Brazil did a little bit of work sort of trying to engage that subnational level better. So I'm excited for the future. Happy that, to see what was able to be completed, and looking forward to a lot more. You have a ton of stuff to do, so let's get to work.
June, a very quick closing thought.
Yes. There's been a lot of discussion about climate finance volume, but I think some of the things I took away was that there are a lot of innovative innovations on the adaptation resilience front. That doesn't necessarily mean that financing this has to always accompany a very high price tag. So I think I carry some hope for that, and maybe understanding the role of Indigenous knowledge in implementing some of these innovations, I think is the main takeaway for me as I carry my research forward.
Great. Mengye, closing thought.
Yeah.
Very brief.
Yeah, two thoughts. One is I really think that the nature and climate agenda should be advanced in the future. It cannot go silos because we see increasing challenge from both sides. And this is the solution. And the second point is that I think the whole point of having an international discourse is to really make sure that the rising protectionism and geopolitical fragmentation are not impeding that has been what has already been worked for the global green transition, which is the market forces. So I think it's really important that the global community is still having the conversation and make sure that barriers are relieved. Yeah, so that's my major takeaway.
Excellent, thank you. And Sue, a closing thought.
I would just say that what I'm looking for this year, I guess. At the COP, as I mentioned, a negotiated outcome that's more robust than last year. And I think Australia, which, under their division of labor, will be in charge of negotiations. I think they can help do that by being clear and coming out with something early. That's the expectation, rather than the some of the confusion that we had this past year. I think the second thing I would be looking for is to make progress on some of these roadmaps that are being that were initiated. They couldn't reach agreement among all the parties to develop roadmaps on transitioning away from fossil fuels and on combating deforestation. So the Brazilian presidency agreed to take those on under its own, whatever, auspices. I think maybe one of a proof of the pudding that progress can be made, and it's not just the COP structure that stops progress because of the consensus requirement. We'll be seeing whether even, coalitions of the willing, whether they can make progress, nothing's stopping them. So that'll be something to look at. And I would say the third thing is to make progress on the ocean issue. Now, we've been talking about nature over the last hour, but this COP31 has a Pacific angle to it because Australia's participation is in partnership with the Pacific. And I think for that reason, plus because it's the right thing to do, I think there needs to be kind of a blue element to this COP. So I'll also be interested in what that package ends up looking like.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Sue, Mingye, Rebecca, and June, for a great conversation. Thanks to everyone in the audience for wonderful questions. And thank you to Justin Warren, Chris Black, and Celia Price, our technical team behind the scenes. A super interesting conversation about where we are with climate and what COP delivered and didn't deliver. Thanks to everyone. Look forward to seeing you sometime soon.